It was one of those quiet Saturdays that made you appreciate the simple things. The sun peeked through the curtains, and I was in the kitchen fixing a shelf Amanda had been complaining about for weeks. Amanda was always particular about the little things. A squeaky hinge, a tilted picture frame, it's the details that make a house a home, she'd say. Lately, though, her focus had shifted. She'd been distracted, her phone glued to her hand, her laughter too forced when I asked what was so funny. I chalked it up to stress. Everyone has their phases, right? Our neighbor, Greg, lived 2 houses down. He was the kind of guy who never missed a chance to chat, grill something on the weekends, or offer unsolicited advice on lawn care. Amanda always found him a bit too eager, calling him the neighborhood golden retriever. She'd laugh and roll her eyes, saying, "You can tell he's the type to keep his fridge stocked with craft beer just in case." Funny thing was, she'd been spending more time around Greg lately. Too much time. It wasn't until that morning that I saw the first crack in her facade. I was putting away my tools when Amanda's phone, left carelessly on the counter, buzzed. Amanda never left her phone out. She was protective of it, always tucking it into her pocket or leaving it face down. That day, it sat there, lighting up like a beacon. The screen flashed with a name I didn't expect to see. Greg. Before I could convince myself to look away, another message came in, "He's in the house. Come over now." My stomach dropped. My pulse quickened. It wasn't curiosity that made me swipe to open her messages, it was dread. There they were, an entire thread. Casual greetings escalating to playful flirtation, and then, the unmistakable confirmation of something I couldn't unsee. "Last night was incredible," one read. Another, "I can't stop thinking about you." My heart pounded in my ears as the timeline of their messages painted a picture I didn't want to accept. I stared at her phone, the words swimming in front of me, until a sound pulled me out of my daze, the back door clicking shut. Amanda. I moved to the window, my breath catching as I saw her in our yard. She wasn't watering plants or checking the mailbox. No, she was slipping through the side gate, her eyes darting around as though she didn't want to be seen. She headed straight for Greg's house. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me, a mix of rage, disbelief, and something close to heartbreak. Without even thinking, I grabbed my jacket and followed her. I kept a safe distance, close enough to see her but not close enough to alert her. Amanda moved with purpose, her steps quick and deliberate. She reached Greg's house, glancing over her shoulder before disappearing through his side door. My world tilted. Every joke she'd made about Greg, every work trip she'd taken recently, every late-night phone call with a friend, they all added up. They weren't jokes or coincidences. They were lies. I stood frozen, staring at the house where my wife had just vanished. My heart hammered in my chest as I imagined the scene inside. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to charge in, to demand answers and expose them both. Another part of me wanted to turn and walk away, to preserve some shred of my dignity. But I couldn't just stand there. I crept closer to Greg's window, every step deliberate. The blinds were barely closed, and through the narrow gaps, I could see enough. Amanda's silk robe was draped over the couch like it belonged there, a mockery of everything it meant in our home. My jaw clenched as I shifted my gaze upward, where faint murmurs and laughter floated down from upstairs. Their shadows danced across the walls, their movements casual, carefree. They thought I was clueless. They thought they could get away with this. They were about to learn otherwise. I didn't stop to think or plan. My anger burned too hot for caution. I crossed the yard and made my way to Greg's front door. Locked. Of course. But there was a side entrance, one I'd seen Greg use when he brought in groceries. It wasn't hard to find, and sure enough, it was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house smelled like cologne, overwhelming, like Greg had bathed in it. It was nauseating. I followed the sound of voices, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors. I didn't care if they heard me. I wanted them to hear me. By the time I reached the base of the stairs, their laughter had stopped. There was a muffled shuffling, followed by Amanda's voice, panicked. "Did you hear that?" I didn't wait for her to investigate. I stormed up the stairs, taking two at a time. At the top, I found the door to Greg's bedroom half open. I shoved it wide, and there they were, Greg scrambling to pull on his pants, Amanda clutching a sheet to her chest. The room was a mess, clothes tossed haphazardly, the bed unmade, Amanda's shoes kicked off in the corner. "What the hell, David?" Amanda screamed, her face a mix of shock and anger. As if I was the one who didn't belong here. I stared at her, incredulous. "What the hell? You seriously think I wouldn't find out? In our neighborhood? While I'm fixing your damn shelves?" Greg fumbled with his words, holding his jeans up as he tried to step into them. This isn't what it looks like." His voice cracked under the weight of the obvious lie. "What it looks like?" I barked a bitter laugh. "Greg, I'm looking at you half-dressed in your own bedroom with my wife. What else could it possibly be?" Amanda glared at him. "Stop talking, Greg. You're making it worse." I turned my attention back to her. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair disheveled, and yet she had the nerve to look defiant. "You've been distant, David," she shot at me. What was I supposed to do? Her audacity floored me. My hands curled into fists at my sides as I tried to keep my voice steady. "What were you supposed to do? Not this." I gestured wildly at the pathetic scene before me. Amanda held her ground, the sheet pulled tighter around her. "You've been so checked out lately. Always working on something, always distracted." "That's rich coming from you," I snapped. "You've been sneaking around with him while I've been fixing our house, paying our bills, and thinking we were building a life together." Greg took a step forward, his pants finally on. "Look, man, maybe we can talk this out." I whirled on him. "You don't get to talk to me. You don't get to anything. This isn't your business." Amanda's voice rose, cutting through the tension. "It is his business, David. At least he listens to me. At least he's there." Her words hit me harder than I expected, but not because they were true. They weren't. I'd been there for her, for us, through everything. The long hours at work, the late nights fixing things around the house, the sacrifices I made so she could have the life she wanted. I took a step back, my chest heaving. "You think that's an excuse? You think that justifies this?" I pointed between her and Greg. Whatever problems we had, this wasn't the solution. This was betrayal. Amanda opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. I've heard enough." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was thick with tension, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. Finally, I turned and walked out, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I descended the stairs, I heard Amanda call after me. "David, wait." I didn't stop. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house where my marriage had unraveled. Then I walked away, knowing there was no going back. I left Greg's house that day with a storm brewing inside me. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one sharper and angrier than the last. Betrayal has a way of twisting the knife deeper the longer you think about it. By the time I reached our house, the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. I didn't confront Amanda that night. She was already in the guest room, probably rehearsing her excuses or plotting her next move. Greg, no doubt, was nursing his bruised ego and counting on me to let this slide. They had underestimated me. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the shelves I'd fixed just hours earlier. The irony of it hit me. I'd been patching up everything in this house, working tirelessly to hold it all together, while Amanda tore it apart. Something snapped in me. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. That night, I started making calls. First was John, an old friend who happened to be a top-notch divorce lawyer. We hadn't talked in years, but when I explained the situation, his voice took on a sharp edge. "You've got a solid case, David. Infidelity changes everything. We'll make sure she doesn't take you for a ride." Next was Marco, a private investigator I'd met through a mutual acquaintance. Marco was the kind of guy who could find a needle in a haystack and then figure out who put it there. "You want dirt on this Greg guy?" he asked, his tone professional but curious. "Consider it done." Finally, I called Ellen, my accountant. I needed to know where every penny had gone. "David, this is serious," she said after I filled her in. "If she's been using your joint accounts to fund extracurricular activities, that's going to bite her in court." By Monday morning, I had an arsenal. John filed for divorce on my behalf, citing infidelity and financial misconduct. He made sure the paperwork hit Amanda's desk by noon. Marco worked quickly, and by midweek, he had a file thicker than a novel on Greg. Turns out, Greg wasn't the neighborhood golden boy he pretended to be. His mortgage was months behind, his credit cards maxed out, and his reputation shaky at best. He was desperate, and Amanda had been his lifeline, at my expense. Ellen's findings were the final nail in the coffin. She uncovered years' worth of transactions Amanda had hidden, unexplained withdrawals, expensive dinners, and even payments for repairs to Greg's house. It was all there in black and white, undeniable proof of her betrayal. Amanda had siphoned thousands from our savings. Some of it went toward her little escapades, but most of it straight into Greg's pocket. When I confronted her with the paperwork later that week, she had the audacity to act surprised. "What is this?" she said, her voice trembling as she stared at the highlighted transactions. "It's everything," I said coldly. "Every lie, every dollar you stole, every secret you thought I wouldn't uncover." She tried to play innocent, tears welling up in her eyes. "David, I didn't mean." "Stop," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You meant every word, every action, every betrayal. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." For the first time, Amanda looked genuinely afraid. And that's when I knew, the power had shifted. Over the next few days, I stayed calm and methodical, sticking to John's advice. Amanda's attempts to talk things through were met with silence. I didn't owe her explanations or apologies. Not anymore. I focused on the plan. The divorce papers had already been filed, and John assured me we had an ironclad case. Marco's findings about Greg were just the icing on the cake. "We can make a strong argument for moral compensation," John said during one of our calls. "If Amanda funneled money into Greg's failing finances, that's misuse of marital assets. The judge will eat it up." Ellen's detailed report was another weapon in my arsenal. Every suspicious transaction was listed, every dollar accounted for. There was no room for Amanda to wriggle out of this one. By Friday, the cracks were showing. Amanda's confident front had started to crumble, her voice breaking during our brief exchanges. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said one night, standing in the doorway of my study. I didn't even look up. "You'll understand when you're sitting in court." She left without another word. Meanwhile, Greg had gone quiet. Marco's reports indicated he was struggling to keep his head above water. His financial troubles were mounting, and without Amanda's support, he was floundering. It was poetic justice, in a way. The pieces were falling into place. Amanda and Greg had underestimated me, believing I'd roll over and let them get away with it. They thought I was weak, blind, complacent. But they were about to learn that I was none of those things. I was ready for the battle ahead. The court date arrived faster than I anticipated, but not fast enough for my patience. I stood outside the courthouse that morning, adjusting my tie and reminding myself to stay calm. Inside, it wasn't just Amanda and Greg on trial, it felt like my entire life was. Amanda walked in with her lawyer, dressed to perfection as always. Her suit was immaculate, her makeup flawless, but there was a strain in her eyes that even concealer couldn't hide. Her lawyer whispered something to her, and she nodded stiffly. And then, Greg entered. I half expected him to slink in, head down, embarrassed to face the mess he'd helped create. But no, he walked in like he owned the place, wearing a smug grin that made my blood boil. His confidence didn't just border on arrogance, it vaulted over it. I stayed calm, my face a mask of neutrality. Let them think they had the upper hand. As proceedings began, my lawyer, John, rose to deliver his opening statement. His tone was calm, measured, almost conversational, but every word was a calculated blow. Your Honor, this case is about betrayal, not just emotional but financial. My client, David, trusted his wife and worked tirelessly to provide for their family, only to discover that trust had been exploited. The evidence will show that Amanda not only engaged in an affair with Greg but also funneled substantial marital assets to support Greg's failing finances. This is a breach of trust and a violation of the marital contract. Amanda's lawyer tried to counter with a weak argument about how Amanda's emotional needs had been neglected, painting me as a cold, distant husband. But John was ready for them. Neglected? John said, his voice laced with incredulity. Let's talk about neglect. He clicked a remote, and a projector lit up the courtroom wall. The first slide showed a bank statement highlighting Amanda's repeated withdrawals, thousands of dollars over the course of months. You drained his accounts to pay off Greg's debts, didn't you? John asked Amanda. Her lawyer objected, claiming irrelevance, but the judge allowed it. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Those were personal expenses, she stammered. Really? John clicked again, and emails between Amanda and Greg appeared on the screen. One read, I covered the mortgage payment this month. Don't worry about it. The courtroom gasped. Amanda looked pale, her composed facade cracking. John continued relentlessly, moving on to receipts for dinners, gifts, even car repairs for Greg's vehicle, all funded by money Amanda had taken from our savings. Let's not forget, John said, his voice sharp as a scalpel, that these funds weren't just marital assets, they were intended for the family Amanda was supposed to care about. Instead, they went into the pockets of the man she was having an affair with. Greg shifted in his seat, his grin long gone. And Greg, John turned to him now, you hosted this affair in your home, fully aware David funded your little lifestyle. Let's talk about moral compensation. Objection. Greg's lawyer called out, but the judge allowed John to proceed. John laid out Greg's financial history in excruciating detail, his mounting debts, his maxed-out credit cards, his late mortgage payments. Marco's investigation had uncovered it all, and now it was laid bare for everyone to see. Greg tried to speak, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to stay quiet. By the time John finished his presentation, the courtroom was buzzing. The judge called for order, his gavel striking sharply against the wooden block. Enough, the judge said sternly. I've seen all I need to see. The decision didn't take long. The judge turned to address the courtroom, his tone firm. It is the finding of this court that Amanda Holt engaged in conduct that constitutes a gross breach of marital trust. The evidence of financial misconduct is overwhelming, as is her misuse of marital assets. Furthermore, the involvement of Mr. Greg Wallace in this affair, and the subsequent financial entanglements, leave little doubt about the egregious nature of their actions. Amanda looked down, tears streaming silently down her face. Greg stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The judge continued. In light of these extraordinary circumstances, full ownership of the family home and all associated assets will remain with the plaintiff, David Holt. Mrs. Holt is entitled only to her personal belongings. Additionally, the court recommends that Mr. Wallace's financial records be reviewed for potential legal action regarding unpaid debts and fraudulent activity. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I felt a surge of vindication. Amanda was left with nothing but the clothes she could carry, and Greg? His smug confidence evaporated when he realized the judgment was only the beginning of his troubles. Within weeks, his house went into foreclosure, a direct consequence of Amanda's mismanagement of funds. Outside the courthouse, Amanda tried to approach me. Her eyes were swollen, her voice trembling. "David. I cut her off. Save it. You made your choices. Now live with them." I turned and walked away without looking back. Greg's house stood empty by the end of the month, his belongings unceremoniously dumped on the curb. Amanda stayed with a friend for a while, but I didn't care where she went. I had my house, my life, and my dignity back. Revenge wasn't just about getting even, it was about setting things right. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in months, there was no tension, no unspoken accusations hanging in the air, no lies lurking in the shadows. It was just me, standing in the place I had fought so hard to reclaim. The paperwork had been finalized that morning. The judge's decision was clear and unshakable: the house, the assets, even custody of the future I thought I'd lost, all of it was mine. But standing there in the empty living room, I didn't feel victorious. Victory would have been keeping the life I thought I had, the one Amanda's betrayal had destroyed. No, what I felt now wasn't triumph, it was peace. The silence wasn't lonely. It was liberating. Amanda and Greg were gone, stripped of their illusions. Amanda's once pristine image was shattered, her carefully constructed facade replaced by a reputation that would follow her for years. Greg, the smug neighbor who thought he could play me for a fool, had lost everything. His house foreclosed, his debts piling up, he had no one to bail him out this time. I walked through the house, my footsteps echoing against the bare walls. It looked different now, stripped of Amanda's influence. The photographs she'd taken down when Greg came into the picture, the small touches she used to make the house perfect, they were gone, just like her. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to patch things up. The cracks, the imperfections, they were part of the house's story now, part of my story. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cold drink in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with streaks of gold and crimson, a fitting end to the day. As the light faded, I let my mind wander. Was this revenge enough? I had stripped them of their security, their comfort, their lies. Amanda had walked out of court with nothing but the clothes she could carry, and Greg had been left to face the consequences of his arrogance and greed. Justice had been served in every way the law allowed. But a small part of me wondered if it truly balanced the scales. The damage they caused couldn't be undone. Amanda's betrayal had left scars I'd carry for a long time. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend easily. Greg's smirks and lies had cost me nights of sleep, days of second-guessing myself. I'd given them years of my life, and they had repaid me with deceit. I stared at the empty street, the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling around me. Would I have done it differently? Should I have confronted them sooner? Walked away instead of staying to fight? The truth is, I don't think I could have chosen any other path. Justice wasn't just about taking back what was mine, it was about proving to myself that I could. That I wouldn't let them win. Amanda and Greg underestimated me. They thought I was weak, passive, easy to manipulate. But in the end, they learned what I already knew: I wasn't the fool they thought I was. This wasn't just revenge. This was my life reclaimed, my future rewritten. The last rays of sunlight disappeared, leaving the world bathed in twilight. I leaned back in my chair, a quiet resolve settling over me. What would you have done? Would you have walked the same path, or would you have chosen another way? For me, this was justice. Maybe not perfect, but enough. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe again.